Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki, Sharma, Upadhyay. Let's get started. The US now sees China as its biggest challenge. But what is America doing to deal with this challenge? 3 meetings that are worth noting right now. America is meeting the Chinese in China. It is meeting the Taiwanese in Taiwan. It is also meeting the Japanese in sorts, engaging with China and its regional adversaries at the same time. It may or may not work, but the developments are worth watching. Aggression is growing on the high seas. Beijing is accusing Washington of supporting terrorists in Xinjiang, and Indo-Pacific security alliances are irking the dragon. So can Joe Biden still negotiate with Xi Jinping, or is a confrontation now inevitable? On Gravitas tonight, we'll discuss that. Also on the show, do vaccines work on mutants? What are false negatives? As the virus changes shape, new questions and new challenges are emerging. We'll discuss that. Did India and Pakistan hold talks in the UAE? Reports have been doing the rounds for a while, but now a senior Emirati diplomat has said that they played an important role in this. As protests flare up in Pakistan, France tells its citizens to leave the country for their own safety. And in Australia, a naval ship's inauguration has led to a controversy thanks to a dance troupe twerking in celebration. We begin as always with Gravitas Global Headlines.
After US President Joe Biden announced American troops will pull out from Afghanistan on the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken held a meeting with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani in Kabul. Blinken has said that any peace process has to be Afghan-led. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has said that the alliance has agreed to withdraw its roughly 7,000 forces from Afghanistan to match US President Joe Biden's decision to pull all American troops from the country starting May 1st. He added that any attacks on withdrawing forces would draw a firm response. India has registered another grim milestone with 200,000 fresh COVID-19 cases. This is the highest numbers of cases that India has ever recorded. 1,038 people succumbed to the disease in the last 24 hours. UAE's ambassador to the US has said his country played a role in bringing down ceasefire violations and calming military tensions in Kashmir, amid reports that top intelligence officers from India and Pakistan met in Dubai in January. The French embassy has advised all French nationals and companies to temporarily leave Pakistan in the wake of violent anti-France protests across the country. At least 5 people have been killed in the protests after Pakistan government banned the radical Tehreek-e-Labbaik, which supports Pakistan's blasphemy laws. The United States has announced a range of new sanctions against Russia in response to what it says are cyber attacks. The moves target 32 Russian entities and include the expulsion of diplomats. A powerful explosion rocked a market in East Baghdad on Thursday, killing 4 people and injuring 17 others, according to Iraq's military. The cause of the blast in the city's Sadr city area in the Habibia neighborhood was not immediately known. Anti-coup protesters in Myanmar splashed red paint on the streets to symbolize the blood spilled and lives lost in the brutal military crackdown. A military-run newspaper reported that at least 19 doctors were charged with incitement for participating in the civil disobedience protests. Record 13-time winners Real Madrid are back in the semi-finals of the UEFA Champions League after 3 years. The Spanish Giants put in a proficient defensive display to hold Liverpool to a 0-0 draw in the second leg at Anfield and clinched the tie 3-1 on aggregate. Manchester City has also reached the semis for the first time under manager Pep Guardiola. The Premier League leaders rallied from a goal down to beat Borussia Dortmund 2-1 in the second leg in Germany for a 4-2 aggregate victory. World number 1 Novak Djokovic has crashed out in the third round of the Monte Carlo Masters after a shock defeat to Britain's Dan Evans. The Serbian fought back from a double breakdown before losing the first set 6-4. He then looked to have averted the upset with a 3-love lead in the second, but Evans rallied to win 7 of the next 9 games and end Djokovic's unbeaten start to the season. 5th seed Alexander Zverev has also crashed out at the hand of Belgian David Goffin.
It's a busy week for the Joe Biden administration. The president and his team have several engagements lined up, and a lot of them have to do with China. The US is trying a new approach right now, a balancing act of sorts. Let me explain why I say this. We are looking at 3 major meetings. The first is in China. Biden's special envoy for climate, John Kerry, is in Shanghai to talk to Chinese officials. The second is in Taiwan. Biden's top emissaries are in Taiwan to discuss the developing military situation vis-a-vis China. And the third meeting is in Washington, D.C. Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga will be at the White House tomorrow, and this will be Joe Biden's first in-person summit. On the agenda once again is China. So the US is talking to China. It is also talking to China's regional adversaries, and these talks are happening simultaneously. Will this approach work? Or is a confrontation inevitable? That's what we'll discuss tonight. We'll begin with the first meeting. John Kerry is in Shanghai to talk about climate action. And the timing is critical. Next week, Biden will host a climate summit of 40-odd countries. So Kerry's mission is very important right now. The US wants China to control its emissions, give up coal-fire-powered stations, and stop financing coal ventures abroad. It's ironic because the United States and China are both the world's worst polluters. And we wouldn't need a global summit if these two countries could find a way to work together and cut their emissions. Now, America's hypocrisy, we know, is legendary. It will pollute, it will also preach. So Kerry is in China to convince China to cut emissions. It is not going to be easy for him, and the reasons are as much political as financial. Financial because switching to green energy will need investments. It won't come cheap. Political because why should China listen to America when America does not listen to China on Taiwan? John Kerry's visit is coinciding with another American mission. A delegation has touched down in Taipei. This is Joe Biden's first unofficial delegation to Taiwan. A former lawmaker and 2 former senior State Department officials are part of this delegation. Over the next 3 days, they will meet senior Taiwanese officials. Reports say Taiwan will brief the American side about China's recent provocations. They will also demand more support from Washington. Today, Biden's emissaries met with Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen. Tsai told the delegation that China's military activities are threatening regional peace and stability.
I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Biden administration for reiterating on numerous occasions the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Recently, we have seen that China has frequently dispatched military vessels and aircraft to carry out maneuvers in the sea and airspace surrounding Taiwan. These actions alter the status quo in Indo-Pacific and threaten regional peace and stability.
So how can all of this go unnoticed in Beijing? Earlier today, the Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a response. It told the United States to quote-unquote take caution and adhere to the one China principle, that same old line, but accompanied by new provocations. This month, 25 Chinese warplanes breached Taiwan's air defense zone. This was the largest incursion in months. And it wasn't the only provocation. The Chinese Navy conducted drills in the Taiwan Strait. The threat is serious. The US intelligence community has come up with a report. It decodes China's military assertiveness in several regional disputes. Now, the American assessment says that there could be 2 reasons behind China's aggression. Reason number 1, Beijing wants to use military actions to demonstrate strength. Reason number 2, Beijing wants to compel neighbors to accept its claims over disputed territory.
China is employing a comprehensive approach to demonstrate its growing strength and compel regional neighbors to acquiesce to Beijing's preferences, including its claims over disputed territory and assertions of sovereignty over Taiwan.
These aggressive actions against Taiwan are expected to come up tomorrow as well. That's when the third big meeting will take place. Joe Biden will sit down with Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga in Washington, D.C. Reports say China is expected to dominate the talks. The United States wants Japan to back Taiwan. Biden wants Suga to issue a joint statement of support to Taiwan. And this is going to be tricky because Japan has its own territorial dispute with China over the Senkaku Islands. And a joint statement on Taiwan will only further aggravate the situation with China. So 3 meetings, 1 agenda, getting China to come to heel. And this could prove to be Joe Biden's biggest test so far. Meanwhile, the war of words between China and Japan is also escalating. It is playing out on 2 fronts. The first, as I said, is the Senkaku Islands. It's a string of uninhabited islands that are claimed by both Beijing and Tokyo. China's provocations have not ended there. Japan is determined to stop them. The second front is the Fukushima nuclear plant, the one that saw a disaster in 2011. Japan has decided to release radioactive water, treated radioactive water, from the plant into the ocean. American allies like Taiwan and South Korea are vehemently opposing it. And China sees this as an opportunity to further its own agenda. It's a rather complex story, and we've simplified it in our next report for you.
This is the East China Sea. China stakes claim to a string of uninhabited islands here, they call the Diaoyu Islands. And Japan stakes claim to a string of uninhabited islands they call the Senkaku Islands. The problem is, these are the exact same islands. In 1968, Japan established a defense identification zone over these islands, an extra buffer of sorts, to safeguard its territorial sovereignty. In 2013, China declared its own defense identification zone. It overlaps Japan's. China uses this zone to justify its expansionism. Under Chinese rules, any aircraft or vessel entering the zone must notify Beijing. Beijing's military adventurism worsened with the pandemic. In March 2020, China's maritime militia damaged a Japanese naval ship. In July 2020, Chinese vessels entered Japan's zone for the longest duration since 2012. In September 2020, Chinese boats collided with Japanese patrolling vessels. In October 2020, the Chinese Navy forced Japanese fishing boats to leave the area. And just last month, 2 Chinese ships again carried out an illegal intrusion near the Senkaku Islands. The provocations are endless. There are growing concerns that China could step up armament and establish a military base on the islands. Adding to these concerns is China's Coast Guard law, which came into force on February 1st. The law encourages China's Coast Guard to take all necessary measures, including the use of weapons, to stop the violation and eliminate the danger. With this law, Xi Jinping has told his Coast Guard to be wolf warriors at sea and use force, lethal force, to assert Chinese interests. Japan, along with the US, has expressed concerns over the law. As Yoshihide Suga heads to Washington on Friday, Chinese aggression, the new Coast Guard law, and the Senkaku Islands will all top the agenda.
This will be our first in-person visit from a foreign leader in the Biden-Harris administration, reflecting the importance we place on our bilateral relationship with Japan and our friendship and partnership with the Japanese people.
The talks might also feature a controversial topic: Japan's plan to release radioactive water from the wrecked Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean. Washington has backed Tokyo, saying the release will be in accordance with nuclear safety standards. But American partners like South Korea and Taiwan are strongly opposing Japan's plan. Both nations with coastlines nearby say the move poses a risk to the marine environment. China is trying to make the most of this disagreement between the three democracies. Beijing is calling Japan irresponsible, its own environmental recklessness notwithstanding.
Yesterday, the China-South Korea Maritime Affairs Dialogue and Mechanism held its first meeting. Both sides urged Japan to carefully and cautiously handle the Fukushima nuclear wastewater issue after ample consultation with international mechanisms and surrounding countries. This approach is extremely irresponsible and will seriously damage international public health and safety and the vital interests of the people of neighboring countries.
The timing of this war of words is significant. The US climate envoy John Kerry is in Shanghai to discuss climate action. By all means, China will use Japan's Fukushima water release plan as a bargaining chip in the negotiations. Bureau Report, WION. World is One.
Rogue states like China depend on the dark arts of politics and propaganda. Now, here facts are irrelevant, they can be minimized or exaggerated to measure. And this is exactly what China is doing in Xinjiang. It has unleashed a war on Uyghur culture. At least 1 million people are in detention. It has all the makings of a... But if you ask China, the world has got it all wrong. They claim to be running re-education centers, not labor camps. What does that even mean? Re-education is basically a form of brainwashing. The Uyghur culture is being systematically dismantled. In its place, these people are being taught Han Chinese supremacy. And China's methods are brutal. Illegal detention, forced labor, torture, state-sponsored rape, and even medical experiments. In international jurisprudence, we call this a crime against humanity. But in China, they call it an internal matter. Every time the world moves against Beijing, it unleashes a propaganda drive. This time, the target is the United States of America. So what are the wolf warriors saying this time? They have published 2 videos. They feature disgraced American officials Lawrence Wilkerson, a former aide to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, and Sybil Edmonds, a former FBI translator. What are they saying in these videos? Both Wilkerson and Edmonds think Xinjiang is America's best bet to destabilize China. So naturally, Beijing has jumped on it. It is accusing Washington of funding terrorists in Xinjiang. Well, we've heard this story before. But as usual, one crucial thing is missing from China's tale: context. Do not worry, we've got you covered here. Lawrence Wilkerson's speech is from 2018. This is a man who helped sell the Iraq war to George Bush. But after all the death and destruction, he retracted his support. How convenient is that? What about Sybil Edmonds? Her speech is from 2015, 13 years after she was fired by the FBI. And for the record, Ms. Edmonds lasted 6 months in the organization. She's a known conspiracy theorist. So these are China's top sources, conspiracy theorists and disgraced military officers. One more thing to note here, both Edmonds and Wilkerson said that the US could possibly leverage Xinjiang, possibly. They did not admit to any such American operation. In fact, looking back at American actions, overreach has not been the issue. Our complaint is the lack of concrete measures. Today, America loves to call itself the defender of Uyghurs, but that wasn't always the case. In the 2000s, the US was an active accomplice. They detained 22 Uyghur Muslims in Guantanamo Bay. So the Uyghurs are not just victims of China's war on terror, they've also suffered under America's war. Then came the presidency of Barack Obama. Would the multicultural president stand up for China's diversity? As it turned out, he chose the policy of silence. Obama did not raise the Uyghur genocide issue during his visit to China. Back then, no one knew where the relationship was headed, so Barack Obama decided to not rock the boat. Like it or not, it was Donald Trump who put the spotlight on Uyghurs, not out of love for this community, but because it was a convenient issue to tackle Beijing on. Nonetheless, it worked. In 2020, Donald Trump signed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. What did it say? All US government bodies would have to report on communist abuses in Xinjiang. These reports would define American sanctions in the future. Another law is in the pipeline, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The House of Representatives has already cleared it. It is now up to the Senate to send it to Joe Biden. Now, this law would keep American firms away from the forced labor camps in Xinjiang. But Donald Trump's biggest move was declaring the Uyghur crackdown a genocide. This was an indictment of the Chinese state, calling it a genocide. Think about what it means. The communist regime was placed on the same level as Nazi Germany. The problem is Donald Trump's actions were punctuated by flip-flops. There were reports that privately he supported President Xi's crackdown. And this is American policy in a nutshell. The right goals for the wrong reasons. Which brings us to the present stalemate. Last month, American and Chinese officials met in Alaska. It was more like a classroom squabble than a diplomatic meeting. China kept calling Xinjiang a domestic affair. But here's the deal. It is not. A genocide cannot be a domestic matter. So where are things headed now? Are more talks on the cards, or is confrontation more likely? At this point, we could be looking at more of what happened in Alaska. Diplomatic meetings that descend into chaos, name-calling and allegations. Talks, you see, are successful when there's a basic understanding between the two sides. But China does not understand the concept of human rights. It is a headstrong bully living in a world of denial. Anti-France sentiments are boiling over in Pakistan. France leave Pakistan has trended all day on Twitter. Some are even calling for the death of the French ambassador. The French embassy in Islamabad has been turned into a fortress. Every French citizen living in Pakistan has been asked to fly back home at the earliest. The situation is extremely volatile. What exactly is happening? And why is it happening? How did it all begin? Our next report has all the details.
These images are from the French embassy in Islamabad. It is being turned into a fortress. Armed policemen are standing guard outside the embassy. Roads leading to the diplomatic enclave are being barricaded with barbed wire. And all traffic is being diverted to other routes because the situation is extremely volatile. Just a few miles away, anti-France protesters are running riot, demanding the release of this man, Saad Hussain Rizvi, the Amir of the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, a far-right Islamist political party. 26-year-old Rizvi has been jailed for demanding the expulsion of the French ambassador to Pakistan, Marc Barretti. Anti-French sentiments have been simmering in Pakistan for months. They started with the republication of Prophet Muhammad's caricature by Charlie Hebdo. With the arrest of Saad Hussain Rizvi, they are boiling over. Hashtag France Leave Pakistan has been trending in Pakistan all day. There were 55,000 tweets as of Thursday afternoon. Some of them even called for the death of the French ambassador. The French embassy is alarmed. There are at least 445 French citizens living in Pakistan and 30 French companies registered in the country. They've all been asked to leave Pakistan temporarily. In a response to WION, French embassy officials have stated, "We can confirm that we have sent a precautionary note to all our citizens in Pakistan advising them to temporarily leave the country if possible due to the recent protests that have caused graver security threats and put our citizens at risk." French nationals are not the only ones at risk. The protesters are not sparing their own Pakistani brethren. In Lahore, a Pakistani cop was beaten to death by an anti-France mob. Similar violent attacks are being unleashed on the police at almost every protest. A total of 7 people have died in the clashes, and 300 policemen have been seriously injured. To save face, Islamabad claims to have banned the Tehreek-e-Labbaik, just like it banned the Hafiz Saeed-led Jamaat-ud-Dawa after the 2008 Mumbai attacks. Suffice to say, the ban will only be on paper. On ground, the situation is far from being under control. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Meanwhile, the Wuhan virus is on a rampage in India. Every day is a grim record. More than 200,000 new cases were reported in the last 24 hours. And this has never happened anywhere in the world. 200,000 cases in just 24 hours, 2 lakh cases. Mini lockdowns have returned. There's a weekend curfew in the national capital now. Every time you open your phone, there's probably some news about the pandemic. But not all of it is accurate. Clear messaging is important right now, and we are trying to do our bit. We are going to answer 5 key questions about the pandemic. Number 1, why are cases rising? Is it all because of the mutants? Number 2, do our vaccines still work? Do they work against the mutants? Number 3, why are vaccinated people getting the virus? Number 4, are kids safe? Because remember, they are the last in the line of in the line for vaccines. And number 5, what happens if you test negative but still show symptoms? Let's take these questions one by one. Why are cases rising? Are mutants to blame for the second wave? Yes. We say yes, but we also add most probably, and I'll explain why. India has reported something called a double mutation. Here's how it works. You have a virus that has already mutated, like the UK variant or the Brazil variant. Now, when this mutation undergoes another level of change, it becomes a double mutation. And these variants, double mutants, are highly infectious. They can even evade antibodies. And they're most likely causing the surge. And we say most likely because to be completely sure, we need more data. Genome sequencing is the only way we can identify mutants, but India's genome testing numbers are dismal. From January to March, less than 1% of the samples were tested, and that's simply not enough to draw trends. Question number 2. Will the vaccines still work? Are they effective against these new variants? In theory, they should be. But experts are warning of reduced effectiveness. Both Johnson & Johnson and Novavax revealed this trend in their phase 3 trials. They neutralized the UK variant, but they were not as effective against the Brazil and South African variant. So vaccines may not work as effectively as earlier. But remember, less effective is not the same as not effective. You'll still be better off with a vaccine. Which brings us to our third question. Why are people getting the virus even after vaccination? And now listen to this carefully. Vaccines are not intended to prevent infection. What they will do is prepare you better. They will ensure that you do not have severe symptoms or end up in hospital. This is the case for most vaccines in the market. They are intended to keep you alive, not make you invincible. So the next time you hear such reports, remember the vaccines are not failing. They're doing exactly what they were meant to do. Question number 4. What about children? Are they at risk, and how much? The first wave saw older people with comorbidities being more susceptible to infection. But that's not the case now. There are more young people in ICUs than older patients in Brazil, for instance. Where does that leave children? They're the last in line to get the vaccines. But on the front lines of this new outbreak, let me show you some data from March to April 10th. More than 60,000 kids were infected in Maharashtra, 6,000 in Chhattisgarh, 7,000 in the state of Karnataka, and 3,000 in Uttar Pradesh. Now, the second wave is infecting more children. We spoke to Dr. Dana Hawkinson about this emerging trend. He's an infectious disease expert from the University of Kansas. Listen to what he had to say.
I think it's a combination of different things. I think, number one, we know that more adults have been able to get vaccinated. I think that helps. We also know that a lot of adults who are out doing the normal things that they were doing have probably already had COVID-19. We know that in a lot of places as well, schools have reopened. And I don't think it's specifically the schools, but I think it's the chance that the kids have more opportunity to get together either in functions like athletics or just get together outside of the school themselves and have those interactions. So I think it's much easier to spread that way. In addition, initially it was thought children don't get the disease and don't spread it. That actually is not true. And I think we're just seeing more evidence of that now for those reasons that I just discussed.
The trend is worrying, but it appears natural. The same rules that apply to you apply to your kids. Mask and social distancing, so playtime with mates will have to wait. Now, question number 5. What if you test negative but have all the classic symptoms? And this is a tough one. This is happening with a lot of people. False negatives are a real scare. Why are they happening? Because the virus has changed, but your test has not changed with it. The normal RT-PCR test that you get done is still looking for the old virus, and you're being sent packing with a negative result. If you don't start treatment, your infection might worsen. So what do? When in doubt, stay home. Quarantine yourself like a normal Wuhan virus patient. Speak to your doctor, treat the symptoms. They may prescribe more tests or use other indicators to diagnose you. But do not leave home until you're all clear. And we understand it's not an easy situation to be in. The virus is throwing new challenges every day. Our health apparatus and our experts are all struggling to keep pace. India's situation, it seems, is worse than last year. You can do your bit by either adding to the caseload or breaking the chain. So keep the mask on. Also stop the infodemic. We are bringing back our message from last year. Contribute positively to the information flow. Do not rely on social media forwards. With all these mutants and false negatives, this is not the time to play doctor. It's the time to listen to one. And beyond all the uncertainties, one thing, as I said, can be said conclusively about the Wuhan virus. This is no longer the same virus that we first saw in 2020. It has changed, it has become more powerful, it has mutated. Our next report tells you all about virus mutations, the ones that are powering the second wave globally.
It began with one. But now the Wuhan virus has more than 12,700 identified mutations. How did this happen? When a virus replicates or makes copies of itself, in the process it sometimes changes shape. Such behavior is quite normal for a virus. By definition, it's always looking for ways to spread and thrive. When a virus mutates more than once, the mutation is called a variant of the original virus. Most of these variants are harmless, but in the case of the Wuhan virus, some variants are now driving a worldwide surge in cases. One of them is the UK Kent variant. Scientists call it the B117. It was first identified in September last year. This variant can travel fast and infect far more people than before. While the United Kingdom has tamed the spread of this variant, in other parts of the globe it's causing havoc. In Asia, around 40% of the cases are said to be of the UK variant. Reports say this variant could be partially refueling the surge in India. Then comes the Brazilian variant, or P1. It seems far more dangerous. Linked to the Brazilian Amazon, this variant led to the healthcare tragedy in Brazil. Experts say it's far more transmissible and perhaps deadlier too.
Although we are not sure if it is more lethal, my perspective is that it is more lethal. We are losing more Brazilians because of this variant that is circulating in our population. So of course, if I were head of state of another country, I would do everything to prevent this variant from entering my country and spreading.
Third is the South African variant, again much more contagious than the original. First found in South Africa, it is now spread to at least 20 countries, including India. Just like the rest, the South African variant spreads easily, but there is no evidence yet if it makes a patient more sick. This variant had forced South Africa to dump the AstraZeneca vaccine. Now, a study claims that it might evade the protection provided by the Pfizer vaccine too. In March, India detected a double mutant variant of the virus. In Maharashtra, 61% of the samples are of this variant. As the name suggests, the double mutant carries two mutations of the virus. They are far more infectious. They can even evade antibodies. So even those who got the virus before and recovered are now at risk. The options to tackle the new mutations remain limited. The existing vaccines might not be as effective as before. Masks, hand sanitizers and social distancing remain our only defense for now. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
2 months back, India and Pakistan decided to renew a ceasefire agreement. It was big news all over the world. The announcement came out of nowhere. When did these officials meet? Who took the first step? A lot of questions were unanswered. But a few weeks later, this report came out. It said that the United Arab Emirates had brokered talks between India and Pakistan. Neither Islamabad nor New Delhi responded. So what exactly was in this report? It talked about a 3-step peace process, a ceasefire, followed by reinstating envoys, and finally a lasting settlement on Kashmir. So where did the UAE slot in? As a mediator, Emirati officials handled the backroom talks apparently between India and Pakistan. At least that's what the report said. Until now, there was no official word on this. It was based on unnamed sources and conjecture. But that's not the case anymore. A senior Emirati diplomat has confirmed the UAE's role. Listen to this.
3 weeks ago, an article came out that basically highlighted the role the UAE played in bringing the Kashmir escalation down and sort of created a ceasefire, hopefully ultimately leading to restoring diplomats and getting the relationship back to a healthy level. We try to be helpful where we have influence with 2 different countries. So India and Pakistan was the most recent one.
That was the UAE's ambassador to the United States, Yusuf Al-Otaiba. He's among the senior most diplomats in the country. But how confident is he of success? Well, to be honest, the expectations are low. The UAE maintains warm ties with Pakistan and India. This was enough to bring both sides to the table. But a lasting Kashmir solution, a resolution, is aiming too high. The ambassador realizes this. He says the UAE just wants a functional and operational relationship, a bare minimum level of talks.
They might not sort of become best friends, but at least we want to get it to a level where it's functional, where it's operational, where they are speaking to each other, where there's lines of communication, and that's our goal. We don't think they're going to become, most favored nations with each other, but I think it's important for them to have a healthy, functional relationship.
To be clear, there were indications that something was brewing. In November, India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar visited Dubai. The very next month, Pakistan's Shah Mahmood Qureshi also landed in the city. And we're not drawing conclusions here, just stating the order of events. Cut to March 2021, the Pakistani leadership was waving a white flag. Army Chief Qamar Javed Bajwa was talking peace. He called a stable Indo-Pak relationship the key to unlocking South Asia's potential. And this was big, especially coming from Pakistan's real power center, the army. How did India respond? With caution. Because we've seen this before. Peace offers followed by deadly attacks. India's demands have been clear from the start. Stop funding terror groups and we'll talk business. The India-Pakistan conflict is not new. Neither is the question of Kashmir. India insists it's a strictly bilateral issue. But many countries have tried to cool tensions in the past. They've all ended in failure because Pakistan cannot retain a government long enough to hold talks with India. And when things appear to be positive, the tanks roll in from Rawalpindi. Australia keeps stumbling from one crisis to another. First, it was the Parliament sex scandals. Now, it is dancers twerking at an Australian military event. It has led to mass hysteria. A dance troupe was hired to perform at the commissioning ceremony for a new ship, and their moves have now triggered a national debate. Take a look.
This is the HMAS Supply, a $1.5 billion naval ship. It was commissioned into the Australian Navy last weekend, but the ship is not making the headline. It has been overshadowed by this, a performance. 7 dancers in Defence Force hats twerking on the dock. What's worse, they did it with the ship as the backdrop. And this isn't the worst of it. If you thought this is inappropriate, wait till you hear what happened next. This clip is from Australia's national broadcaster ABC. It shows the dancers performing, while dignitaries like the Governor-General and Chief of Navy watching on. The fact is, it did not happen like this. Apparently, the performance happened before the main guests arrived, so the video is deceptive, and ABC has apologized for the misleading edit. But that doesn't bail out the Australian Navy. Reports say they hired these dancers to perform, and this revelation has led to a lot of criticism.
I'm shocked and I'm disgusted.
Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said the Defence Department would look into the failing standards. He also slammed the misreporting by ABC. The dancers themselves have become targets of shaming and sexualization. An Australian newspaper blew up pictures of the performance. The dance troupe says they have been subjected to trolling and attacks online. They feel threatened and exploited. For a country that has witnessed 2 months of sexual harassment and assault scandals, the fiasco at the ship launch in Sydney shows how Australia is struggling to take lessons from the past. Bureau Report, World is One.
Now here's a story that's all too common: workplace harassment. It comes in many forms, from sexual harassment to offensive jokes, to gender-based discrimination, to intimidation and ridicule based on one's performance. Often all these forms of harassment go unreported, as victims are unsure of what to do, or due to lack of support from their colleagues, or simply because their bosses are too powerful, perhaps indispensable for the organization. In China, one employee decided to stand up for herself. She beat her boss with a mop after he constantly sent her lewd text messages. The woman has become an internet sensation in her country. But the incident has also spurred a debate about the persistence of workplace harassment despite all the talk about it. How the smallest of incidents can ruin a great job and turn any company into an unproductive environment. Here's a report.
It was a sight to behold. A government worker in China whose boss was sending her harassing text messages decided to do what many a worker would not dare to. She tossed water on his face and thrashed him with the business end of a mop. Watch how. The woman has been identified as So, a government worker. The man has been identified as Wang, the deputy director of a state-run poverty alleviation agency. According to reports, Mr. Wang was sending Zhu unwanted text messages, and that others in the office had received similar unwelcome attention. On being confronted, all he could do was hide his face and make failed attempts at offering an apology. It is unclear when the incident took place, but the 14-minute video has been viewed millions of times. Social media users were full of praises for what they called an uncommon display of resistance. In a country with limited workplace protections against sexual harassment. But why just China? Workplace harassment is all-pervasive. In a 2019 survey, 25 to 85% of all American women experienced sexual harassment at their workplace. In the United Kingdom, 13% of women experienced various forms of verbal or visual harassment. And India witnessed a 14% rise in sexual harassment the very same year. In another global survey in 2020, 58% of harassed women did not file a complaint. Only 25% of the victims said they could easily report the incident. 50% of women who were victims agreed that harassment hurt their career. 99% of employees said they could successfully recognize workplace harassment. 56% of men believed that reported workplace harassment goes unpunished, and only 1% of the victims confronted their harassers. Workplace harassment is a global plague. The root cause of why it persists is the unwillingness of a victim's colleagues to speak up. and the failure of employers to implement their policies. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
What happens when young children, in a bid to protect their communities, are having to pick up shotguns nearly as big as themselves? This is what's happening in the south of Mexico, where children as young as 12 years old are being taught to defend themselves from murderous drug cartels. Here's a report.
In Mexico's southwestern states of Guerrero, children have enlisted themselves in a self-defense group. They are taking part in defense against drug traffickers, toting replica rifles and clutching wooden sticks. Guerrero sits at the heart of Mexico's heroin trade. It has been racked by violence in recent years. The militia is training the boys, some as young as 6, to serve as the last line of defense should a cartel strike the community.
I'm ready to fight and give my life if needed for my people, my family, by confronting the criminal group.
Nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Madre del Sur mountain range, Ayahualtempa is one of 16 indigenous communities protected by the militia. The communities are isolated hamlets with limited cell service. It is accessible only by a winding 2-lane highway known as the Corridor of Death. As rival gangs fought for control of the drug route and tussled with civilian militias. Last year, Guerrero recorded 1,434 murders out of 34,552 nationwide. Residents have accused the authorities of abandoning them to their fate. Despite kidnappings and killings, communities have gone on virtual lockdown. Kids stopped going to school. The women halted their weekly trips to the nearby city to do their shopping and sell their beans and squash. The men ventured out only in convoys with a dozen armed companions for fear of being ambushed.
Entonces, si el gobierno ve que es malo.
If the government thinks that it is bad to prepare children, why not question the criminal group that brings in many high school children with high-caliber weapons? Meanwhile, we are preparing our children to make our community safer and to protect themselves.
Mexico is accustomed to a steady drumbeat of violence. The images of the children in military-style exercises has pierced the public consciousness, drawn comparisons to child soldiers, and raised questions about whether this will become a new norm. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
With that, it's a wrap. We're leaving you as always with Gravitas Images. Thanks for watching.